Dr. Pakaluk is an internationally recognized Aristotelian scholar and an expert in Aristotle's ethics. He was a Marshall Scholar at Harvard College and took his Ph.D. in philosophy at Harvard under John Rawls. The author of many scholarly books and articles, including influential works on friendship, he has also written The Appalling Strangeness of the Mercy of God, a study of holiness in ordinary life, a book about his late wife, who was herself heroic in many ways, including in her battle against cancer that took her at a very young age. A member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas and a chair and professor of philosophy at Ave Maria University, it is claimed that Pakaluk has tied Thomas Reid, the Scots Commonsense thinker, for having the most children as a philosopher. We are delighted to have Dr. Pakaluk with us here tonight and are grateful especially to the Wheatley Institution for the generous sponsorship which has made this session possible. Now, Dr. Pakaluk, I'll turn it over to you.
Is this okay? You can hear, okay. I'll leave it to you to guess how many children Thomas Reid had. Anyone know? 14. You're right. Not as many as Bach. So I'm deeply honored to be here. What a wonderful group of scholars, students, professors. And you would never say this is an honor to be invited to this sort of event, but for me, this is one of the greatest honors I think I could experience. So thank you for the invitation. I don't know who was responsible for it. Maybe my wife, who spoke last year. I appreciate it. Now, the topic changed a little bit. It does have something to do with friendship, but it's a little bit different approach from what I originally pitched to Caitlin. So I think you'll find it interesting, but I'm sorry that your introduction didn't quite match, but what you said was very true nonetheless. So the question I wish to investigate this evening is whether marriage is a species of friendship, whether there is a wide class or genus of human relationships called friendships, and marriage is appropriately understood as one species within this genus, just as mammal is a genus of living things, and zebra is one of its species. This question may look like a narrow or pointless question of classification, and you may start falling asleep now. That's what we're warned about. In fact, I think it helps to illuminate the nature of both marriage and friendship, and how both are related to such things as romantic love and courtship, although I won't really be bringing that up in the talk. We could perhaps leave for discussion afterwards. I shall argue that marriage is not a species of friendship. People often speak in such a way as to suggest that it is. A husband can say of his wife that she is his best friend, and vice versa. Sometimes people describe the change that happens in a marriage when it moves from perhaps a heated and extravagant romance to a warm and stable bond of affectionate loyalty as they have finally settled down and become friends. When people are courting, their parents or older siblings may advise them to develop their relationship by making sure, as it's said, that first of all, they are friends. People can pick up similar notions from the tradition as well. Aquinas, for example, says somewhere, doesn't he, that between a husband and a wife there can be friendship in the greatest degree, maxime amicitia, which would seem hard to achieve if a marriage wasn't a species of friendship at all. You may even have read in preparation for this conference an online essay by an authority on friendship discussing the so-called natural friendship between husband and wife. Okay, so no one's laughed, so I gather no one's read that essay, actually. There's an interesting way in which the idea that marriage is a species of friendship turns up in the debate over same-sex marriage. You know that advocates, this is a tedious topic for me by now, but I'm sorry, I'm going to bring it up because I think it's fairly important. You know that advocates of same-sex marriage seem to take marriage as a given. They do not offer an account of what it is or of why it should have the features it is taken to have. Why is marriage between two persons only? Why should there be any restrictions on how closely related by blood a couple can be to be married? Why ever was it thought necessary that a marriage should be consummated? What serves as consummation anyway, and why? Why must sexual relations or sexual attraction be part of the package at all? The advocates of same-sex marriage cannot answer any of these questions. They don't even try. Actually, they must not try, because their argument actually depends upon their viewing marriage, as I said, as a given, as a self-standing, sui generis relationship. Do not attempt to explain why marriage traditionally has been given special treatment by the state. Concentrate solely on the claim that it is irrational and unjust, given that some types of couples do enjoy this special status, to deny that same special status to other couples. So long as marriage is viewed as sui generis, that is a charge which, of course, cannot be defended against. In response to this sort of critique comes the reply, marriage isn't sui generis, and in fact, we'll provide an analysis and tell you what it is. Marriage is a kind of friendship. Homosexual relationships are friendships, and marriages are friendships. Note that this argumentative strategy is already appealing because it establishes a plane of similarity and equality between marriages and homosexual relationships. They have this in common, at least, that they are both friendships. They are species of the same genus. But friendships, the reply continues, arise within and belong to the private realm. There are many different kinds of friendship, a wonderful variety of close personal bonds which people can form. Pairs of mountain climbers, for instance, fellow musicians, comrades on the battlefield, brother with brother, mother with adult daughter, and so on. Friendships, as a rule, are left in the private sphere and are not recognized in law. Note now that this line of argument has appealingly shifted the burden of proof. The default for friendship, the argument maintains, is that friendship enjoy a private status only. The burden of proof falls, therefore, on someone who wants to claim that some species of friendship should enjoy public recognition in law. The argument continues. There has traditionally been only one exception to this rule that friendships are by default private. Only one kind of friendship which has received any special legal recognition, namely that species of friendship which traditionally has received the name of marriage. This friendship alone has traditionally received legal recognition because it alone includes something important to society which no other friendship has, namely generative acts and the capacity to procreate children. Here the argument concludes. And note that it does two other appealing things. First, it changes the characterization of what is at stake. When marriage was regarded as self-standing and sui generis, one might have thought what was at stake was whether certain historically despised persons, homosexuals, were going to be allowed to enjoy the same special status as heterosexuals. The problem seemed to be a problem over whether certain individuals were to be allowed into or excluded from a certain kind of special status. But once we identify the general class, friendships, of which marriage is a species, then the question gets reframed, and it becomes one about the species of friendship under consideration. Does it deserve a status akin to marriage, and on what grounds? The second appealing thing that the argument does is to change the comparison class. If we admit that the dispute really boils down to what status should be accorded homosexual unions, if these are considered as friendships, then the crucial question becomes not, is it irrational if we treat this one species of friendship, homosexual union, differently from this other and unusual sort of species, marriage, but rather, is it irrational to treat this one species of friendship, homosexual union, differently from that multitude of other species of friendship and translate it from the private to the public realm? One can commit an injustice by treating unequal cases equally. Let me repeat that. One can commit an injustice by treating unequal cases equally as much as by treating equal cases unequally, as Aristotle said, by failing to make discriminations when they are required, as well as by making them when they are unmotivated and invidious. This argument maintains, at least, that the concern over the one sort of justice can be counterbalanced by the concern over the other. So this is an ingenious and effective argument which depends fairly crucially on the idea that a marriage is a species of friendship. Now, I don't want to say that marriage has no aspect of a friendship. Certainly it does, as marriage involves the reciprocal wishing of goods and a union of affection. But marriage is not a friendship modified in some way to become marital, but rather something other than a friendship, which, if pursued correctly, takes on some aspects of friendship. One might accept the label natural friendship, or perhaps conjugal friendship for marriage, because these terms suggest that marriage, as having the character of a friendship, is consequent to its nature as a conjugal relationship. To say that marriage is a natural friendship suggests that it is a friendship only because, first and by nature, it is something else. As a comparison, consider the relationship between father and son. A father and his grown son can be friends, but that they are father and son is prior. The friendship is based upon the natural relationship. It is a result of father and son correctly following out on that natural relationship. Just so, father-son friendship is not a species of friendship. A species is, as the word says, a specification of the genus. One does not start with a friendship specified in some way and arrive at a father-son bond. It would be absurd to say that among the many kinds of friendship, there's one which is very deep, because there the friends have resolved to share not simply particular activities, but their actual biological life. As if one could take a friendship to a deeper level by making it so that one friend became the biological offspring of the other. I'm aware that these points about classification and genus and species may sound like so much quibbling. I could defend myself by pointing out that Aristotle, too, begins his great treatise on friendship in books 8 and 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics, acknowledged by everyone still to be the great masterwork on the subject, by raising and then solving at length what seems to be an arcane problem about classification, whether there is one form of friendship or more than one. But I am asking this logical question because by pursuing this question and asking whether marriage really can be grouped along with other friendships as a species of the same genus, we are led to see more clearly that marriage is something very different from friendship, because it exists by nature, whereas particular species of friendship do not. Marriage is a natural institution. Its origin, its goals, and the laws that govern it inherently are not the result of human convention and choice, but friendships are. Although, to be sure, friendliness and the disposition to form friendships is natural to human beings, a friendship itself is an at-will association marked by equality, sharing, some kind of bond of affection, and the wishing and exchange of goods, in some respect, what Aquinas called the communicatio of that friendship. No species of friendship is a natural institution, as marriage is. Let me set down some ways I'm impressed by the contrast between friendship and marriage. First, I do not think there is any norm, standard, or requirement within a friendship for the friendship to become deeper or more serious than it is. Friends spend more time with each other or not, and they make greater sacrifices for each other or not, as they please. Their obligations seem to arise only from some particular agreement or commitment to meet at the tennis court in the morning, if the friends play tennis together, or for buddies in the military to care for each other and bring back the other safely if wounded in the raid. It is true that in a friendship, a long history of shared assistance will often create a presumption of favor and affection in the future towards one's friend. I do not think that it creates an obligation if that assistance really was rendered all along in the manner of a gift. If a pair of friends do not become over time like the storied instances of friendship in history, say the famous pair of Orestes and Pylades, they haven't failed at friendship. Again, if we say truly that each friend is another self to his friend, this claim is true not in the manner of a norm, but rather in the manner of a description. No one in becoming a friend is thereby bound to become as much another self to the other as possible. Other self simply measures the admittedly praiseworthy degree of the friendship. But the friendship is pursued to that degree, but that the friendship is pursued to that degree at all is supererogatory by its nature and free. In contrast, marriage does seem to have an inner normativity. Spouses, for example, are bound to be sincere and to unburden their hearts to each other. They're bound to be willing to sacrifice their bodies and health, if necessary, for the sake of the common good of the household, and especially the children, as that a woman sacrifice her youth for bearing children, or sleep for nurturing them, or that a man should grind himself down, if necessary, in manual labor to put bread on the table. The normativity in marriage directs toward definite achievements which involve life and the nurture and education of children, giving birth, raising to adulthood, caring for when sick, accompanying at the deathbed, and burying. Note that these are all achievements rather than a better quality of the relationship or any subjective good of the spouses, such as felt self-actualization or self-realization. Second, friendships arise from likeness, but marriage does not. That friendship arises from likeness is evident in children. We judge easily that some pairs of children are more likely to become friends because they have more in common. Similarly, college administrators put similar freshmen together as roommates on the reasonable expectation that in that way they are more likely to get along as friends. It is because likeness is the cause of friendship that friendships are much more common with members of one's own sex. Friendships especially develop around what we do in our free time, as Aristotle pointed out, because our use of free time reveals what we take life to consist in, and friendship involves a sharing of life. But men will generally be better matched in such activities with men and women with women. Even differences among friends of the same sex are evaluated and appreciated on the basis of likeness. It is true that often friends are drawn to each other because each sees strengths in the other which correspond to some of his own weaknesses. For example, an accountant and a philosopher could become close friends because the philosopher admires the accountant's business acumen and the accountant admires the philosopher's astuteness in discovering deep explanations. Yet in such cases, I think, each admires the different thing in his friend precisely because he would like to become like his friend in that respect, if possible. The philosopher would like to be more astute at business, the accountant more astute at identifying basic reasons for things. The friendship is even the means by which each becomes, in intention and virtually, similar to his friend in that respect in which they are different. But marriage, in contrast, is based on complementarity, not likeness. Complementarity involves a different appreciation of difference. One admires the difference in the other, but wouldn't want to overcome the difference by becoming like the other in that respect. An example of this attitude, which has always rung true for me and has stood for this phenomenon, I take from Sigrid Undset's other great novel, The Master of Hestviken, sometimes called Olaf Audunsen. there's a detail where the protagonist, Olav, glances and marvels at the delicate white arm of his betrothed, Ingunn, as they're crossing, I believe, a river. This occurs when they're both quite young. That image throughout Olav's life stands for Ingunn's weakness and vulnerability compared to him. The image draws forth tenderness and care from Olav. But Olav, a big, strong Viking, never wants to acquire a delicate white arm for himself. In a relationship of complementarity, each marvels at what the other possesses, but not in the manner of wanting to acquire it for oneself. The marriage, like the friendship, is indeed the way in which one spouse somehow possesses these marvelous things seen in the other, yet they are possessed in the manner of something which serves to complete and to make whole, not in the manner of something which serves to intensify or strengthen a similar trait in oneself. Since I've mentioned complementarity, I want to say a little more about it, enough to suggest, I hope, that the complementarity between the sexes may plausibly be maintained to be not an unfounded bias of particular cultures, but somehow rooted in, or at least intimating, the deep nature of things. If so, then the cultural expressions can perhaps be explained in terms of the deep reality which they manifest. There is a Christian way of tracing complementarity to fundamental realities, as is found in the so-called theology of the body, which traces the so-called nuptial meaning of the body to its imaging God as a communion of persons. I am familiar also with a metaphysical and classical account, which Aristotle in places articulates. On this account, metaphysically, a male is defined as one who begets in another, a female as one in whom something is begotten. The distinctive activity of the male, as male then, is analogous to the imposition of form, insofar as making is analogous to begetting, and the distinctive activity of the female, as female, is analogous to the reception of form and matter. When a relationship between male and female is viewed as involving reciprocity, then one thinks of each as taking on aspects of the other. The male is receptive mainly in his activity, and the female active mainly in her receptivity. The male receives in acting, his receptivity is an aspect of his activity, whereas the female acts in receiving, her activity is an aspect of her receptivity. In human beings, the different characters found in one who begets in another versus one in whom something is begotten ramifies throughout every dimension of human life. First, because human beings are genuine unities of body and soul, or spirit and flesh. And second, because procreation for a rational animal is not the mere conception of a living animal, but rather must include nurturance to maturity and education. And the character with which one nurtures and educates will extend just about to every human activity. I don't often quote Leo Strauss, but he said many fine things, and one which he said something like this, that just as it was the temperament of the ancients to interpret lower realities as manifestations of the higher, so it is the temperament of the moderns to say that higher things are nothing but projections of or masks for the lower. I maintain that the ancient, not the modern approach, proves most useful for understanding sexual complementarity. That in human reproduction, the female's horizon is long, as exhibited in slow arousal, monthly cycles, a 9-month pregnancy, breastfeeding for a year or more, and awareness of a 20-year childbearing window. But the male's horizon is short, and in a moment, don't need to give examples of that, is one manifestation taking this approach. of the metaphysical difference between them. It's not the soul or the controlling instance. So that boys tend to like to throw balls and men to play golf, acting on things at a distance, or men in households do the same thing repeatedly until they become experts at it, and they are better at imposing discipline, which seems irksome because it creates distance between parent and child. These are understandable if to be male is to be such as characteristically to beget in another. That girls like to make things which are inert, and mothers tend to prefer to console and accept rather than to discipline. These too are also understandable if, fundamentally, to be female is to be such as characteristically to be one in whom something is begotten. Please note, by the way, if one needs to say it, that all claims about what boys do, or what girls do, or what men do, and what women do, like any statement about the expression of a tendency or a nature, is a statement, I understand, about what holds for the most part. Moreover, of course, the expression of such a tendency can be magnified or largely suppressed by education and culture. However, I will say this, it is an interesting question whether, if sexual differences are truly like talents, and men tend to have a talent which women as a rule lack, and women a talent which men as a rule lack, whether education, here as elsewhere, is better to the extent that it draws out and magnifies, rather than aims to oppress those talents which are good. But to move on, an interesting point of contrast between friendship and marriage, arising from the complementarity found in marriage, is that in a marriage, the husband and wife occupy offices and represent their sex. The man as husband represents that half of humanity which is male toward his wife, while the woman as wife represents that half of humanity which is female toward her husband. This role of representing one's sex is clear from weddings, and it explains why the couple, in many traditional ceremonies, are likened to a king and queen, because kings and queens are capable of representing entire peoples. In contrast, in no friendship does a friend represent a class or a group. It's happened on many occasions that I've been among a group of friends where one is a professor, another a lawyer, a third a doctor, and so on. Occasionally, someone might reflect on that fact and say something like, we've got a lot of pooled talent here. But that is all. If the lawyer, say, were to leave, we wouldn't think we'd need to find someone else to continue representing the lawyers. Heaven forfend. Or, if a second lawyer showed up, we wouldn't suppose his company wasn't wanted because, after all, we had someone representing the lawyers in the group already. A related point is that friendships, as they are between equals, do not exhibit any settled or characteristic division of labor, no natural or easy or typical differentiation of responsibilities, except on account of different talents for the work that happens to be at hand. One friend among a pair of rock climbers is typically the lead climber because he's more skilled, that is, for now, in comparison with his friend. One friend on a doubles team plays forehand, the other backhand court, because for the while that seems to be successful, but it could change. But the near universal expression of marriage across different cultures and times involves a division of labor where it is found easiest and best for the wife to take responsibility for matters within the household, which becomes her domain, and the husband doing the same as regards matters outside the household. Even couples which regard that division as lamentable and purely cultural end up testifying to it, say in the language they use, the husband helps out at home, or by not managing to be consistent. One won't see the wife climbing the 40-foot ladder to paint the house. This division is not one of skill, furthermore. The husband might be the better cook. In fact, he might be a professional chef for all we know. But conceptually and metaphysically, dinner time is more like the mother's earlier breastfeeding, a shearing by the mother of nutritive substance, which is from her, than it is like the father's professional work in a restaurant kitchen. These points about complementarity lead to a third point of contrast between marriage and friendship, namely that there's an inherent structure of authority in a marriage, but not in a friendship. That there isn't in a friendship as such is clear. Friendships, as was said, are among similar equals. And the ideal for friends is to associate in such a way that neither friend has or wields the sort of authority which the other takes himself as bound to obey. Indeed, such an interaction would be unpleasant and contrary to the nature of the friendship. A friend might propose something to another or express that he wants, anticipates it will be heeded, but if his friend is for the moment stubborn or churlish, he'll likely not recriminate, but simply opt out of whatever was planned. Of course, it could be possible that one friend have authority over another outside of the friendship at work. However, in contrast, in a marriage, there is a structure of authority. The husband is, in some sense, the head of the husband-wife pair, and as father, he is furthermore the leader of the household. That a marriage has inherently a structure of authority is what makes it suitable to serve as the basic cell of society and be that institution which is intermediate between the private and the public domains. C.S. Lewis states the case for the leadership of the husband well. It will inevitably happen that two persons disagree fundamentally about some matter that they regard as of the greatest importance, and where they furthermore cannot agree upon any method for resolving their disagreement. If they are to remain united on friendly terms, one of the two must be empowered to decide such cases for the both of them. And it makes sense that this would be the man, Lewis says, because it is more characteristic of the man to be impartial in matters concerning the household as a whole and in its relation to entities outside the household. But one could argue for the same conclusion on a different basis from the point of view of any children the husband and wife might have. It is a remarkable fact that children view and feel themselves as bound in conscience to obey the parents who procreated them. Sorry, let me say that again. It is a remarkable fact that children view and feel themselves as bound in conscience to obey the parents who procreated them. This fact already shows that there is a structure of authority present in the family, because the children could not feel themselves as so bound unless the marriage itself of the parents already contained within it the origin of this claim. No mere friendship could give rise in this way to relationships of authority, which bound in conscience others outside of that friendship. Aristotle and Aquinas regard this claim upon the conscience of the child as the basis of all original authority in a society. Now, the child feels himself bound in this way to both the father and the mother together, a fact reflected, for example, in the commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. But the child could not be bound to both at the same time, unless in principle it was possible for them to overcome disagreements, which requires, in turn, again, that one of the two, father or mother, be empowered to decide potentially divisive cases. But that it should be the father, one might argue, is testified to in the very way in which parents give commands to children. The command of even a strong mother typically has additionally the character of an entreaty and a plea, which suggests that her authority is somehow underwritten by the fathers, and in fact mothers typically do look upon their authority in that way. But the father's commands are typically unqualified, or at least they are without any character of a plea. The fourth great contrast between marriage and friendship, also related to complementarity, involves the role of the body. It seems that the wish for some kind of bodily union or solidarity is found in friendships which are particularly intense. In testimony to this wish, it seems, many cultures have devised ceremonies of affrèlement, or brother rituals, whereby friends conceal their friendship by becoming in some way like brothers, perhaps spiritually, or perhaps figuratively by the actual mixing of blood. However, in all these cases, the ideal for the friendship of the bodies of close friends is precisely this relation of brotherhood. Friends who have a very intense friendship want to be brothers or sisters. Actual brothers or sisters think of themselves as of the same stock or from the same root, as Aristotle says. Now, as was said, friends in intense friendships want to liken themselves to brothers. But note, as regards this phenomenon, it would be incorrect to say that these blood brothers think of their bodies as being united. Talk of the body here is too superficial. It doesn't get to the right reality. It brings in the aspect of the surface and of the skin. Brothers or sisters don't really want to touch each other's skin. Right? You get hit for that, right? That's not the respect in which they are united. Their unity is more than skin deep. They're blood brothers, not body brothers. Some blood brothers, as was said, aim to become so by even cutting through their actual skin to get to the blood that is supposed to unite them. The unity of blood brothers is a physical union which is, as it were, from below and from within, not from without and by one side. That is why the ideal of brotherhood excludes the relationship of espousal, and friendship, conceived of as akin to brotherhood, excludes marriage. The spousal relationship is a gift relationship. Each gives and continues to give the body to the other. But brothers are one blood already, and therefore cannot each give his body to the other. A man cannot give something to himself, as Wittgenstein is quoted as having said, and Aristotle said before him. This is the most fundamental reason why close relatives are forbidden from marrying, since if they are too close, then the fact of espousal as a gift relationship is impossible, or at least obscured. I should say, then espousal as a gift relationship is impossible, or at least it is obscured. It should be observed that being espoused is generative, because it makes no sense to say that one gives one's body to another except through and in relation to the procreative act, as directed toward an offspring, which, insofar as it unites into one, the bodily existence of the parents, fully realizes that gift. One cannot simply by fiat make some arbitrary action an act of giving one's body to someone. What could that mean? To give one's body to someone else? Is it to make oneself a slave? One cannot give one's body to someone else while alive in the way that one can give his body to science after death. Certainly the exchanging of pleasures related to parts of the bodies isn't a gift of the bodies. It isn't even a gift of the pleasures if those are merely exchanged quid pro quo. A fifth and final point of dissimilarity between friendship and marriage is that marriage is, and has generally been regarded as, holy, but friendship has not been given this distinction. A friendship can, of course, be holy incidentally, say because the friends are each holy, as for example St. Basil and St. Gregory, or in the sense that a friendship between a woman and a man remained chaste because their bond in charity was holy, as with St. Francis and St. Clare. But marriage is itself holy, even if husband and wife are far from saints, and even if they don't remain chaste. Indeed, the main reason why unchastity would be wrong is that it offends against the holiness of their marriage. We must avoid making the mistake of thinking that the concept of holiness belongs solely to the Abrahamic religions. Of course it does not. All cultures, even ours, which are so greatly influenced by atheism, recognizes some things and actions as sacred, sanctified, and somehow set apart by some divine action. I'm also not referring to the idea that marriage is raised to the level of a sacrament in Christianity. I mean simply marriage as a natural institution. But why has marriage and not friendship been accounted holy? Well, what other sorts of things are regarded as in some way holy? Tombs? Battlefields? Where matters of life and death are decided? Where suffering is endured and heroism displayed? Temples? Where divinities are represented and served? And oracles, or places of manifestation, where divinities are taken to have appeared or communicated. When pagan cultures count marriage too as holy, I believe to be one of those cases where those cultures are intimating something which Christianity helps to make manifest. That in the mystery of Christ, the mystery of man is made manifest. Now, there's a paragraph here, and it could be expanded to several paragraphs. It's short. Basically, one could engage in the project of looking at things from a pagan point of view and in a pagan culture and seeing just the meaning that they have and just what they intimate, and then moving to Christianity and see how that's unfolded and made manifest. I'm not doing that. It's just too complicated. I'm compressing it all. So I'm not reading Christianity. Don't take me to be reading Christianity into things where it isn't found. It's not what I wish to do. Okay, so just understand this paragraph in that spirit. What Christianity helps to make plain is that marriage is holy because, although it is instituted by nature, nature's author is God. The pagan intuits this obscurely. Again, the marital embrace is the context in which it is God's preference to bring new life into existence, which for rational beings must involve a sheer act of creation. And then the child resulting is in some way on loan from God, not really belonging to the parents. Marriage is inherently a place of suffering and of heroism too, involving ultimate realities of life and death, as we have said. You know that childbearing gets likened to standing in battle in many cultures. The chances of surviving giving birth were probably lower than surviving a battle. It is impossible to marry someone truly without thereby being committed to losing half of oneself in death, as in till death do us part, or being willing to acquire an obligation to a child to die for that child if necessary to save it. Perhaps it is somehow intuited too that marriage in its complementarity reveals God as not envious, as Plato says in the Timaeus, but bountiful. It is an image of the incarnation Christians hold, and as the fathers taught. For the pagans, perhaps, as an intimation of the nearness of the divine. Marriage for a Christian is a mystery which represents love of Christ and the love of Christ for the church. And marriage communicates, as we mentioned, the commandments of God and the natural law through the claim the parents make on the consciences of their offspring. Friendships considered as friendships are not holy in any of these respects. In conclusion, when I view friendship, its nature and role in human life, and then turn my attention to marriage, I am impressed by the remarkable dissimilarity between the two. I have spoken of how marriage, but not friendship, has an inherent normativity. That friendship is based on similarity, but marriage on complementarity, as seen too in the structure of authority inherent in marriage. That marriage is spousal, but friendship is likened to brotherhood, which positively excludes espousal. And that marriage is holy, but friendship is not. I concede that a man and woman can begin to associate as friends and that their relationship can change to courtship and marriage. It's also true that married couples often do, in limited domains, associate in the manner of friends. Miss Anscombe did with Peter Geach. And of course, it's valuable to encourage attention to and love of the other's character in a romantic relationship, which is akin to each regarding the other as a friend. But it seems mistaken to hold that marriage is a species of friendship. The intention to find a friend or form a friendship ends just there in a friendship. Marriage is not a friendship plus something more. Marriage in particular seems not well described as simply a more comprehensive friendship than any other, as if what sets marriage apart from other friendships is that other friendships are restricted to sharing activities A through Y, but in a marriage one can share Z as well. Because there are some activities which some friends share, but which chaste married couples will refuse to share. And also, more importantly, because the comprehensiveness of marriage is actually indirect. A marriage is comprehensive only because it involves establishing a household, which is where the varied goods of life in their comprehensiveness are ordered and applied to children. If marriage is not a friendship, then what is it? What is marriage? I've been emphasizing that it is a natural institution. That is to say, it is instituted by nature, not by us. Its origin, goals, and inherent laws come from nature, by which I mean they are prior to human choice. They cannot generally or in the long term be successfully altered or suppressed. And they are part of an ordered system, such that if we neglect them or think we can improve upon them without yet understanding their bases, we will suffer unintended bad consequences, as is true with anything else which is by nature. Marriage is better described as the ideal mode of procreation for rational animals than as a friendship. The procreation of the species is not something we start or devise. It is ongoing across centuries, like a moving river, or wave upon wave falling upon the shore. We are free only to discern the best cultivation of this natural phenomenon, and with sobriety aim at that. But that is enough on this topic. The rest can be left for discussion. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes for questions. So if anybody has anything that they would like to ask Dr. Pakaluk. Do you want to field your own questions?
Either way, it's okay. You field the questions.
Okay, great. Right in the front here.
You described very well the differences between marriage and friendship, but could you give for us laymen here a more formal definition of what friendship is and marriage is? Rather than just descriptions, like a more, I guess, exact one-sentence definition if possible.
Formal definition.
Let me try.
So what benefit would a formal definition have? Can you just explain? Sorry, we take away your microphone when we ask you questions. That's part of the trick. Throws you off balance. Okay, you don't have an answer to my question. That's all I thought.
I assume everyone can hear me now. It would be that when we are doing, you could say, Anscombe apologetics, or when we're on campus having dialogue with people who disagree with us about this, being able to conceptually summarize in short bits, you might say, a kind of elevator talk on the difference between the two, by having formal definitions, I think would be something that's a prudential aid.
Okay. Well, I did give kind of definitions in passing, so it may have gone by quickly, but I've described friendship as an at-will association of equals including a bond of affection, in which they wish and exchange goods in some respect. That's from Aristotle. It's not something I thought up just now. And marriage, I want to say, is procreation for rational animals.
The red there?
One of my favorite books about friendship is The Little Prince. And in that book, the prince befriends a fox who tells him something very important, which is that you are responsible, that you are responsible for what you have tamed. It seems to me that friendship does have an inherent normativity based on familiarity, which is that, what I mean to say is that time spent with one another creates certain obligations that are not explicitly chosen. And I think one could also argue that in some ways, marriage itself has obligations that are chosen. I mean, you choose to get married. You speak of the marital debt, but the way in which that occurs is something that has to be willed. You arrange your family structure. Can you talk a little bit more about why, in fact, there is a difference there?
No, that's a good question, and you picked on my first point, and my points got better, I think, as I got along writing this thing. I think what I want to say is that I want to speak about a specific kind of normativity, that there's no requirement within a friendship to become as good friends as possible. But I think there is a requirement within a marriage to become as good spouses as possible. And if everybody's going to fail in the second respect, but it will also be understood to be a failure. But in the first respect, nobody, I think, so to speak, examines their conscience on that point of view. They might, with regards to missed opportunity cost, or something that a chance to say something that would have helped, or a chance to do good, or something like that. But they wouldn't view it as falling short of what was required by the relationship. That's I think, the way I want to put it. Now, you might say, well, if the friendship doesn't have that character, then how can it give rise to these other interesting things? And you mentioned one, and I think another one would be correction. Right? And this is one of the tropes from the classical literature on friendship. A friend is obliged to tell his friend the truth if he's going astray in some way, and nobody else will tell him. So, yeah, it'd be interesting to come up with an inventory of those sorts of obligations, and then have to defend that somehow they're not coming from the relationship itself, or just point to this one difference in which one has a kind of normative and the other doesn't. But I agree with you that was pretty weak.
Hello, thank you very much for your lecture. My question relates to another Greek philosopher, Plato, and whether or not you think there is useful things to be found in his thought with regard to vindicating complementarity in relationships. So I know that there's been kind of debates in the scholarly community as to whether or not Plato argues for a more modern conception of equality between men and women, as there not being very many differences between them, or whether or not he can be seen as embodying a classical view of complementarity. For example, in his dialogue, the Phaedrus, many claim that he affirms the relationship as being devoted and close, and the uniting of the same as being all right, but in the Symposium, he argues that maybe the uniting of opposites is superior. So my question is just, in your study of Greek philosophy, do you think Plato can provide insights into providing the type of philosophy that we all here value to affirm traditional marriage and relationships like that, or do you think he's more modern and too modern in that?
That's a good question, and I'm hesitant to say anything on it since I'm supposed to be an expert in these subjects, so I'd like to think about it some more. But just kind of off the cuff, if you just take this an off-the-cuff answer, I would say that Plato is not particularly strong on this notion of complementarity. You didn't mention Book 5 of the Republic, but that seems to be a place where he is really explicitly rejecting it, isn't he? But in a certain sense, the notion of complementarity is imposed to him because he's not really talking about complementarity in in Book 5 of the Republic. He seems to be arguing against something else. I'm not sure how I'd want to characterize it, but you might say it's not complementarity. In the Symposium, why do you say that he has some idea of the closest union being between opposites? Just that we desire what we lack?
Yeah, so another fine philosopher at Ave Maria, your colleague Michael Segru, argues, or at least has argued before in a lecture, that he kind of makes fun of Aristophanes' speech and the other speeches that basically tried to vindicate homosexual relationships and saying the closest link is between two men or two things that are very similar. Mm-hmm. And he argues that Socrates' later speech of the goddess of love actually points to differences being a better way of uniting rather than sameness.
Yeah. I think I probably want to approach this through the idea of procreation. So, although Plato had a very, he didn't seem to have a really satisfactory notion of complementarity. He did seem to think that love had to be procreative. There's a very good discussion of this in Anthony Price's book, Love and Friendship in Plato and Aristotle. He actually makes a shocking claim at this point when Anthony Price, well, he's a Catholic now, but he wasn't a Catholic then. He actually made the shocking claim, because it has kind of testimony of impartiality, that Plato's views about procreation seem to be similar to Pope Paul VI in Humanae Vitae. He says this in the course of his scholarly discussion in that book. It's kind of an interesting idea. I think it raised a few eyebrows. But even in the myth, in the Symposium of Aristophanes, it's not satisfactory to the gods that the embrace would not be procreative. So he has the private parts moved around so that when they come together, they would actually, if the two halves that have the proper procreative parts come together, they'll actually have offspring. And of course, the Symposium is very strong on this idea of birth in beauty. Right? Love gives birth to beauty. It's not sterile. And Plato dislikes sterility quite a lot. I don't think he thought that you could have love which wasn't fecund, and this is similar to the idea of the Timaeus about the love of the demiurge not being motivated by envy but overflowing, what gave rise to the maxim of the Neoplatonists, bonum diffusivum sui. I think that the origin of that idea is in Plato.
So my question was kind of sparked by someone who mentioned the idea of getting married. I noted that phrase being used. So the idea of friendship, the difference between friendship and someone getting married, and that made me think of consummation that you mentioned, that why should marriage involve consummation or the ability to consummate? And so my thought about the idea of consummation being another way of saying the procreative action or reproductive action of rational beings, as you describe marriage or define marriage, what's the interim time then between like a marriage ceremony in our Christian society, between the marriage vows and the consummation? So is that still marriage? And I would assume yes, but is it one and the same with the consummation, or is that only a construct of society and religion, or can we explain that naturally as well, that interim period being marriage? Because I'm committed to consummating this with the person that I've made my vows to, but I've not yet consummated it and not yet made a procreative act as a rational being. So what's that interim period? Is that still marriage? How would you describe that?
Between the marriage ceremony and the consummation.
Right, if that's not yet a reproductive act of rational beings, and therefore not in...
I have a friend whose wife, I'll tell a story, wife at a wedding reception was approached by this friend's best friend at the time, who always had a kind of crush, right, on the woman. And he came up to her, to the bride, at the reception, saying jokingly, "No, we can still run away together. My car's waiting in the parking lot, let's go." And she's in her white wedding dress and everything. She said, "Well, what do you mean? We can just still run away." He said, "Well, you haven't consummated it yet." She said, "How do you know?" I think it just counts as an imperfect marriage. It's marriage, but it's not perfect. So there are degrees of perfection. This is something that a concept of degrees of finality, which is taken for granted in other cultures, like Aristotle just treats it as entirely non-problematic. People who come upon Aristotle think, well, what can this mean? Things that are more final and more perfect than other things. Isn't perfect just perfect? So that consummation would be rendering it more perfect. It's complete at the wedding ceremony, but it needs to be completed. That's a great story, though.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your lecture, Professor. I think, if I'm not misinterpreting you, I think that you said that marriage is a natural institution, whereas friendship is not a natural institution. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Aristotle in the Politics says that man is by nature a social creature, and it would seem that, how else are you a social creature besides the formation of friendships? So, I mean, I don't understand how Aristotle would say that friendship is not a natural institution in the same way that marriage would be.
Okay, well, good question. Well, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says something very interesting. He says that man is more a coupling creature, more of a conjugal creature than he is a political creature, insofar as the family precedes the state as fundamental, as a kind of, we would say basic cell, but he doesn't use that language. Fundamental for states. So there's that interesting passage you might want to reflect on. I've thought about it a lot. I'm not sure exactly what it means. What I mean is that friendship is I do think that the capacity, proclivity of human beings to form friendship is by nature, but no particular kind of friendship is by nature except marriage. I just call it a kind of friendship, but marriage is. Take that back. Marriage, it's late. Marriage itself is a kind of relationship which is instituted by nature. That's to say, it originates in nature. You couldn't say that of any relationship that you have. You might want to say that, something like what Aristotle called the heteirike philia, the friendship of comrades reaching their prime. It's so common, and it seems to have such important value in society that you might want to identify that as, in some sense, naturally instituted. You could kind of make a counter-argument in that way. But I can see that the capacity for forming friendships is natural. This particular type of relationship is natural in the case of marriage, but not in the case of any friendship you can point to. Kind of a simple point, really. Well, no, but I deny that marriage is a species of friendship. I say that I do. In the end, my view is somewhat similar to the idea that I think there's something right in saying that sui generis. I would kind of put friendship here, and marriage is, so to speak, something else entirely. It's living animals have to procreate, and that's how we're supposed to procreate in any sense of supposed to. By nature and God's plan, or just in terms of common sense and prudence. That's how it's supposed to work. Right? If you view things in that way, that this is kind of, I said procreation for a rational animal, then you're disposed to look at hooking up, what we're concerned with. Those are just defective marriages. It's shocking to say this, right? But it's like that. Those are, like Jesus saying to the woman in the well, you have 4 husbands or 5 husbands, however many it was. It's a certain sense, every hooking up is a marriage of a certain defective kind, an irrational kind, so to speak.
Many of my friends believe in cohabitation, and by the definitions you've given us, that is a type of marriage. How can we argue rationally that illegal or religious marriage is more perfect or a better form of this expression of love between two people?
Well, there's a lot of literature on that. I'm not sure that there's anything that derives specifically from my talk that could be applied in that way. Right? But for example, just prudentially, those relationships tend to presage failed marriages later. There There's a sharing of experiences, which if it's not with somebody you're going to marry, is going to detract from the unity and kind of exclusivity, intimacy of the future marriage. Typically, there are flaws in the relationship, and there's no easy way of getting out of it because it's too inconvenient. There's an element of necessity that typically comes into these cases. Recent statements in the Catholic Church have pointed to how a lot of couples cohabit because they view it as economically almost necessitated. And yet, that sort of relationship should have freedom.
Thank you.
So my question is not as complex as everybody else. It's very simple. So I actually do tell people, because I come from a Christian worldview on many of these topics, that's why I'm here, so I can get the academic views and argue. So I tell people that, yes, you don't have to be friends with somebody to marry them. And people look at me weird.
You have to what? I'm sorry?
You don't have to be friends with somebody to know that they are the one for life, to marry them. So I've been arguing this for like a year and a half now. So this brother asked what was the interim period between the marriage vows and the consummation. So what is the interim period, like what is called courtship to the consummation? Like, what can we tell people who say, I need to talk to, a girl needs to talk to a boy and be friends with him to know if it'll maybe work out in the future? So what is that interim period called before engagement?
But prior to engagement.
Yeah, because my understanding of your talk is that either friendship, you shouldn't enter friendship because friendship may not lead to marriage, or I think that's what I understood the talk was.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
Well, a couple of things. I'm not an expert on this by a long shot, but isn't betrothal in kind of more ancient cultures exactly that time period between something that has the same weight as a wedding ceremony and consummation? No, betrothal. You actually have a public ceremony which solemnly binds people, and they just have not come together, right? I think that's typically what betrothal means, not engagement. Or that's what it has in many cultures meant.
In the beginning, tells the person that they want to get married, and so they start.
My wife works a lot on this question of what you think you're supposed to get out of marriage, right? And if you think of marriage as, I said, involving certain achievements as regards fundamental realities of life and death and so on, then what you're looking for in your spouse are going to be character traits that will enable you to do that successfully, like a willingness to work hard, delay gratification, ease in cooperating, trustworthiness, certain kind of seriousness of character. We'll come up with different lists, but you have the idea, right? So I would say that period before getting engaged, this can also happen during engagement because that's a time of discernment, right? Should be a time in which one is getting a certain amount of comfort that the person you think you might want to marry does actually have these traits. So we're not looking for romantic values in the other person, but for virtues in the other person. And as Aristotle said, it takes some time. There can be shorthand. I mean, it can be the case that somebody's with a group of friends who, so to speak, testify to their character. And you know some people of those in that group very well, and so you immediately just presume this person has good character. You can kind of just take that for granted, and then move on very quickly. And then there is this very interesting phenomenon of people who fall in love and they say they know within seconds or minutes that they're going to get married, and their marriages work out. So that's a bit of the mystery, a bit of the marriages are. Courtship and falling in love, it's something outside of us. I had this paragraph at the end, and I tested out my wife, and I think she was rushed. She didn't pay attention to it, but I'm really fond of Aristotle's way of looking at making a claim and then seeing how other things fit in and make sense relative to it. Like you ask the question, why is it that people think that springtime is a time for falling in love? Right? Why? Right? Or why is it that when you're in love, you're highly sensitive to natural beauty? And why is it that couples who are courting or in love think that somehow it's appropriate that they be in areas of natural beauty, that it's somehow reflecting something about themselves? And why is it they like to think of their relationship as somehow, the result of forces that are at work, and it's a match made in heaven, or it's like the couple on the bow of the Titanic in that ship, and the waves and the force of the wind and so on. That's very romantic because we're Heathcliff, and the sense that there are these big forces at work, and you're somehow being swept away by them, right? And that's my view. That's my view of marriage. Marriage is. It's a force that keeps the species alive, but that's obviously that's not entirely correct. I mean, I'm saying that to kind of get for a certain kind of shock value, but I would stick by this formulation: procreation for a rational animal. I think that's what it is, and that's its place, and it's very far from, and viewed in that way, it's very far from what we call friendship.
So thank you for your talk. So the role of friendship then, is it unimportant or irrelevant, like a prior friendship to an engaged couple, so they were friends first? That whole scenario, is that just irrelevant or like unimportant because the relationship changes? Like what would you consider that aspect of the friendship in the further?
I think important for,
relationship.
Okay. So you're asking me questions about things that I was supposed to be talking about but didn't write my talk on, which is good. But that may mean that my answers, I don't always, I may not be ones that I'd agree with. I've had a lot of time to think about them. But I want to say that for engagement, what's important is a different kind of activity from forming a friendship, which is courtship. Now, part of courtship has to be what one would call in the realm of finance due diligence. Right, you have to make sure that you're not courting somebody who has some deep character flaw that's going to subvert, undermine, wreck the whole thing. It's be proved to be unwise, right, to marry this person. But once the due diligence is done, so to speak, and I hesitate to call that forming a friendship with the person. I don't think that that's its purpose. I think its purpose is to become, you can admire the fine character of the other person, the fine traits, and so on. But then I think the main activity of engagement needs to be courtship, which is very different. Courtship is a kind of preliminary seeking of the gift and proposing of the gift. Now, this is really crucial, I think, for a successful marriage, that you don't take the other for granted and that you regard each day together as somehow a free gift. And we need practice for that. We need to prepare for it. We need to get the habit of it so that in the difficult times of marriage, when you're up at 2 a.m, and there's this wonderful phrase from, what's that book by Sheldon Van Alken? A Severe Mercy, right? Where their image is a cup of water in the night. That's the phrase they use, right? Very romantic thing. If somebody in the middle of the night asks you for a cup of water, will you go get it? I mean, obviously, when you're courting, you would, right? You'd go 3 miles by foot, barefoot, to the next village to prove, right, that you would get a cup of water. I think you should when you're courting, right? But when the baby's crying and it's a matter of getting whatever the formula or a diaper or something like that, and it's 3 a.m, you have to get up early for work, and it's actually the 10th day in a row this has happened, and right? Then you need to be able to summon that resource of a cup of water in the night. I mean, couples who have courted just have tremendous advantage in that way, I think. It's hard to make that grow in marriage. It's easy to remember it.
A question. So you've spoken a lot about complementarity and its role in a marriage, and the difference, obviously, the distinctions then between marriage and that it's not a species of friendship, but something else. But I have a question that I think is probably not just on my mind, but on a lot of people's minds. And that is outside of the context of courtship, perhaps, or outside of the context of marriage. Do you think that men and women can truly be friends?
Well, I would maintain that for married couples, no. I mean, that to me is clear. That all friendships or all relationships with members of the opposite sex have to be mediated through your spouse. Right? So it's always, as a couple, you're related to the other person. Now, obviously, in work situations, there are many times you're working very closely with another person, but suppose it's, well, should we get drinks after work? Right? Then it's no, unless your spouse is also invited. Right? So that's clear. Now, since I take everything else to be leading up to marriage, I mean, I think that's either in the true sense or in these corrupted senses of marriage. And now I've expanded the notion of marriage quite widely. But yeah, you can go back and say, well, what I learned is that hooking up is marriage. That was supposed to be funny. It's worrying me that you didn't laugh at that, actually. But I suspect the same is generally true, that it's very hard for people who are male and female to be just friends without somehow falling in love. There's a great Spanish proverb, between a male saint and a female saint, bricks and mortar. I think the problem only gets worse the better the people are. So I have to come down and I have to say, well, it's possible, it's rare, but generally it's not really that possible. It's not that, practically speaking, it's not really attainable, I believe. Now, that's different from groups getting together in a friendly way.
So my question is about sort of friendship within a marriage. It seems to me that you can have a marriage, a completely functional marriage that doesn't involve friendship between the two spouses, but it also seems that it sort of makes a marriage easier in some ways. It may even be an essential part to having really an excellent marriage, that the two spouses have a friendship together, that they have some similarities that they're able to talk about, and in ways that don't necessarily relate just to their family life or just to the rearing of children or procreation of children, that they enjoy going out and to art museums together and these sorts of activities, sharing activities together in this way.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't want to be like those philosophers who make an extreme claim and then spend the next 5 years of their life taking it back bit by bit. But which that's basically the career path of philosophers, as you know. But, well, I think it's rare that in these cases that you describe, without the marriage, you'd actually be doing these things, this woman or man, as the case may be. So my wife and I, we will hike in the mountains together, but I would never pick her for a hiking companion if I weren't married to her. Now, I think a very interesting phenomenon is this, talking. Right? It's this movie Marty. Probably a lot of people have seen it, where Marty just starts gushing and he's talking, and they're in the cafeteria. How many? You have to see this great movie with Ernest Borgnine. It's one of the great classics. But there's a scene where they're falling in love in a cafeteria late at night, or a cafe late at night, and he's just gushing on and on. He can't stop talking. It's the only person in his life he's ever just wanted to keep talking to. And I find that's very endearing, because there's something real there. I don't know that happens to everybody who falls in love and gets married, but it happens to a lot of them. They spend a night talking, right? And what's the significance of that? For example, at the end of such a night, would you? I'm thinking of a friend who told me that the first couple of nights they spent all night talking, and the next night, the night after that, they spent all night kissing. So, what's the significance of that? Would you say at the end of the night that you spent all night talking, you've become good friends now, you've become really close friends with this person? You wouldn't, actually, right? So why not? I mean, that's an interesting question, why you wouldn't. it's a kind of exploring of how you view things. And there's kind of an unrestricted discussion, isn't it? Like you talk about anything, I mean, the deepest things, and you reveal what's in your heart and your plans and your ideals and your aspirations and so on. It's not like, I don't know, two philosophers getting together to discuss the de anima or something like that. That's not the nature of the discussion. Right, if you did, then you'd become boring, and that would be the end of that evening of discussion. I wanted to talk about my ideals, and he kept talking about the soul in Aristotle's De Anima, book 2.
So just to clarify, what you're saying is that activities in the absence of marriage that would, I should say, in the absence of marriage normally be considered activities that friends would share fall under a different classification than friendship when they are done with the bond of marriage.
Right, I think that, exactly. And I think there are certain married couples where they have parts of the relationship are like a friendship. I mean, probably Anscombe and Geach discussed philosophy before they got married, and they continued discussing it the same way after they got married, right? But, so you'd have to maintain that, first of all, you'd be doing with this person anyway, right, even if you weren't married, for you to claim that this is like an aspect of friendship that is kind of cropped up within the relationship of marriage. But I maintain most of those things are actually cases which you wouldn't do them with this person you're married to.
And then also in the role of friendship prior to marriage. So suppose two people are friends and then ultimately they court and become married. Yeah. Friendship is basically, in that case, the conduit to courtship. You start looking for those virtues which you wish to explore further in courtship, a period in which you decide there's an actual match, not just of the nature of a friendship, but rather on the, I won't say necessarily deeper level, though often it is, but on a different level, a sharing of values and virtues rather than of interests and similarities.
Yeah, the prior friendship could take care of this question of what I call due diligence, right? But we all know this, that the relationship changes. And so, oh, really? That's the way you're looking at me, or that's what you expect? So, and it goes off in a different direction. Now, if you say that love, courtship, and marriage is a species of friendship, you have to say it's not going off in a different direction.
And then one final thing, sorry to sort of three birds with one stone here, but wow, I hate when that happens, completely forgot.
Take your time.
Right, marriage as essentially procreation for rational beings, and in this case, procreation doesn't just mean the creative act, it also means carrying to term, it also means caring for the child, educating the child, raising the child with intellectual, moral, emotional instruction to adulthood, to the stage of independence.
Yes.
So that definition of marriage, if that's accepted by the opposition, then the rest follows.
Yeah.
The thing is that I'm sort of wary of using this argument in like a public context.
Oh,
because
yeah. Well, that's a good point. Okay, don't get me wrong. This is not supposed to be how we should be debating things in the public sphere. Right. So I think the argument which I referred to as a clever argument, I think is a very effective argument to make in the public sphere. However, I think it's important for people such as us, I believe, to have exoteric and esoteric understandings of what we're doing. Right? And it's really important for Christian culture and Christian civilization that we have a deep and a full view of all of these things.
To know why, as Christians, we're doing it.
We're in the public domain, we have to argue on the very slender basis of agreement which we have with people.
Because, I mean, the one greatly effective strategy used by proponents of that which they term marriage equality is that all of the things that are present in a male-female relationship, even as procreation goes, they say, okay, so it's impossible for men and men or women and women to physically procreate, but there's always adoption. There's always like sperm donors, for example, surrogate mothers.
So there's that aspect. Then there's also the argument that 2 men or 2 women can raise a child equally as well as a man and a woman, essentially with gender theory and the interesting semantics used therein, essentially arguing against the fact that there is such a thing as complementarity of the sexes, or at least that
Right.
two
So
people
there's
of the
an
same
interesting
sex can be
right.
complementary.
So there's
by
a
gender.
question mark I'm raising about this. What I said was it's certainly ingenious, and whether it's an effective argument in the public domain. If you concede that they're both the same sort of thing, friendship, then you certainly open yourself up to this kind of counter argument that you're describing. You can just keep on adding the elements until you're approaching something that looks like it's the same. And I'm also very concerned with there's a kind of misunderstanding of what marriage is, as, so to speak, viewed from that side. So it can look like it's just a really, really close friendship. And that's how it's often described. And if it is, well, then why is it my very deep, and we can acknowledge very deep and intense bond with this person, which I'd like to see solemnized in something like an affirmation. Why isn't that have the same status and the same kind of significance as marriage? Well, it could be. I don't need to go in that direction. I'm not sure I want to. I mean, I think that there are cases where homosexual unions, whatever you want to call them, really do turn into genuine friendships. So, and they're not imitating anything, but they do think that this intensity of friendship, which has to be acknowledged is a very good thing, is in its own way, not imitating, but just in its own way, side by side with what a marriage is. And I think that's gravely mistaken, right? And I don't think we should speak in such a way that encourages that.
Well, thank you very much for that very enlightening talk, and thank you, and for answering all the questions. So it's true, as Dr. Pakaluk said, that he took the remarks in a different direction than I had anticipated, but I think it's also important to note, nonetheless, that in understanding clearly that marriage is not a species of friendship, that it's something different in kind, we also then understand more fully the space for friendship, and understand that in relationships, that there doesn't have to be a tension toward sexual intimacy in every relationship, because friendships are a different thing in kind. So I think that's an important thing to recognize as something that needs to be emphasized in our culture right now, precisely because if there is no understanding of the importance of gender complementarity, then any possible relationship seems like it could become romantic, right? So to see the difference in kind is important for bracketing off that really, really important space for friendship, which is also important for a flourishing human life, and a space where we learn the virtues that are also necessary for a happy marriage, which I'm sure Dr. Pakaluk would agree with as a good Aristotelian. So just a few announcements before we adjourn for the evening. So first of all, one of our sponsors, the Alliance Defending Freedom, you may have seen their table at the reception earlier this evening. They're an international legal advocacy organization that works for the right of people to freely live out their faith. They employ a strategy of training, funding, and litigation to empower their allies and achieve victory for religious freedom, the sanctity of life and marriage, and the family. And specifically in relation to the university campus, Alliance Defending Freedom's Center for Academic Freedom works with students to help them understand their constitutional rights and equip them to live their life on campus in a way that reflects their faith. So I'm just going to show a very brief, about 1 minute video that gives an example of one of the many cases that ADF's university team has represented.
I know how it is to be a student on a college campus and not have anyone to talk to because you have a certain religious belief, you're a certain faith.
Young people who are serious about their faith need some place to go where they can be educated and supported in their views.
How do we create leaders that will be faithful into the next generations to serve the purpose of God in their own generation?
Many of the attendees at the Collegiate Academy are college upperclassmen who feel called to leadership in law and public policy. Collegiate Academy delegates are going to participate in a week of lectures and other discussions with some of the top Christian minds in the country. Not only are they tremendous scholars, but they're devoted Christians.
We've gotten to talk about everything: bioethics, constitutional law, even a lot of philosophy and history.
One of the other things that the Collegiate Academy offers is a practicum series that prepares students to both apply for law school and thrive once they're there.
We have mentors who are either in law school or have graduated law school or studying for the bar.
The way the attorneys and the mentors invest in us is incredible.
We don't simply train individuals, we train entire classes. These are classes that live together, eat together, worship together, pray for one another.
It was such a comfort to be around people who have that similar disposition to follow Christ, to want to love Him in a deeper way.
Not only broadening my horizons intellectually, but spiritually, as not only a student of political science, but also a daughter of God.
I'm finding other young people that God's preparing in the same way, and we're developing a network, and by the grace of God, I hope we can go forth and reshape this nation.
What Alliance Defending Freedom is doing is extremely important for the young people.
This has implications for this nation and this world.
So please enjoy and continue the conversation, and I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow morning. Good night.